She had been rejected 3 times. 3 men, 3 towns, 3 train platforms where she stood with her one battered suitcase and watched a stranger's face fall the moment they saw her walk toward them. That uneven step, that slight drag of her left foot, that thing she could never hide no matter how carefully she moved. 3 times she had boarded the return train alone. Now she was stepping off a 4th. If you've ever been told you were too broken to be loved, stay with me. This story is for you. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this reaches. The train smelled like coal smoke and wet wool, and the particular exhaustion that settles into a person after they have been disappointed enough times that hope starts to feel like a bad habit. Elena Voss sat in the last row of the last car, which was where she always sat. Not because the seats were better, they were worse, rougher, closer to the wheels and their noise, but because sitting in the back meant she could watch the other passengers without being watched herself. It meant she had a few extra seconds, when the train finally slowed, to collect her face before she had to show it to anyone. She was 31 years old. She had come from a small village outside Bratislava 9 years ago, with her mother's silver cross, $40, and a belief, not quite faith, but something close to it, that America was the kind of place where a woman could make herself new. She had worked that belief hard. She'd learned English in 6 months, taken in laundry, then moved up to a textile mill in Pittsburgh, then found her way to a boarding house that didn't charge her extra for being foreign, which already put it ahead of most. And 3 times she had answered an advertisement in the back pages of a newspaper, written careful letters in her still slightly formal English, exchanged photographs, traveled to places whose names meant nothing to her. Billings, Great Falls, a town in Nebraska she already couldn't remember. And each time she had stepped off a train and found a man who looked at her left leg and then looked away, and then, within the first 20 minutes, found a polite way to tell her it wasn't going to work. The first one had said he needed someone who could keep up with the farm work. The second had simply not shown up and left a note with the station master. The third had been kind about it, which was almost worse. "You deserve someone better suited to your situation," he'd said, as though her situation were a disease he was too decent to catch. She didn't cry anymore. She'd used up crying somewhere around the Nebraska train station. What was left was something harder and quieter, a kind of stubborn animal refusal to lie down. So here she was. Montana. A town called Harlan Creek, which she'd found in a different newspaper, a smaller advertisement, less flowery language than the others. The man's name was Caleb Rowan. Widower. 2 children. Working ranch outside of town. His letter had been short and plain. "I am not looking for a perfect woman. I am looking for a steady one. If that interests you, write back." It had interested her, the honesty of it, the lack of promises, felt safer than the ones that had offered too much. She'd written back. They had exchanged 4 letters. He had not asked about her leg, which either meant he hadn't noticed her mention of it or he was waiting to use it against her later. Both possibilities seemed equally likely. The train lurched and began to slow. Elena looked out the window at a sky the color of old pewter, low and heavy with clouds that couldn't decide whether to rain or snow. The mountains in the distance were sharp and dark. The land between the town and those mountains was wide and flat, and looked to her eyes like the kind of place that didn't care whether you lived or died in it. She picked up her suitcase from the rack above. The same battered suitcase, repaired twice with wire and once with a strip of leather she'd cut from an old belt, and made her way to the front of the car. She held the overhead rail with her right hand and balanced against the sway. Her left leg ached the way it always ached when the weather was about to change. She had stopped being angry at it a long time ago. It was just a fact of her, like her dark hair or her habit of biting the inside of her cheek when she was nervous. She was biting it now. The platform at Harlan Creek was not much of a platform, a wooden overhang that needed painting, a station master's window with a cracked pane of glass patched with brown paper. 3 men standing in the cold, 2 of them talking to each other, not paying any attention to the train, and one standing apart from the others, hat in his hands. Elena saw him before he saw her. He was taller than she'd expected, though his letter hadn't mentioned height, and she hadn't thought to ask. Wide-shouldered, dark coat that had seen better years. His hair was brown, going a little gray at the temples, and his face was the face of a man who spent most of his time outside, weathered and still, with deep-set eyes that were currently scanning the train doors with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not eager, not bored, something more careful than either. She stepped down. He spotted her. She could tell because his eyes stopped moving. And then she made herself walk toward him the way she always made herself walk toward these things. Head level, pace steady. No attempt to hide the limp because hiding it was exhausting and it never worked anyway. She stopped a few feet from him. Mr. Rowan. Miss Voss. He put his hat back on his head. He had not looked at her leg. Or if he had, he'd done it when she wasn't watching and his face had not changed. You had a long journey, he said. It wasn't a question. He looked at her suitcase. I can take that. I have it. All right. He didn't argue. He just nodded and turned slightly toward the edge of the platform. Wagons around the side. You hungry? She blinked. 3 arrivals, and no one had asked her that first. Yes, a little. There's a place on the main street. Nothing remarkable. But it's hot. He glanced at the sky. Snow before nightfall, I'd guess. We should eat before we head out. That was it. No speech about what he was looking for. No inventory of her face, her hands, her walk. Just, are you hungry? There's a place. Let's go before it snows. She followed him around the corner of the station. The restaurant was called May's, which was also the name of the woman behind the counter, who was maybe 60 and had the kind of eyes that missed nothing and forgave most of it. She glanced at Elena when they came in, then at Caleb, and something passed over her face. Not unkindness, exactly, more like calculation. Caleb, passing through? Stopping in. Usual for me. Miss Voss? Elena looked at the chalkboard. Her English was good enough, but sometimes in new places she still felt the half-second delay, the mental translation. The soup, she said. And bread, if there is bread. There's biscuits, May said. That is fine. May disappeared. Caleb set his hat on the table between them and looked at her directly for the first time, not at her leg, but at her face. He had gray-green eyes, not an unkind face, but not an easy one either, a face that had been through things and had the patience that comes after. I should tell you something before we go any further, he said. Here it was. She set her hands flat on the table, ready. I'm not good at talking, he said. I never have been. My late wife used to say I could go 3 days without a word and be perfectly content. I want you to know that because I don't want you to think, if I'm quiet, that something's wrong. It's just how I am. Elena stared at him. That is what you want to tell me? I thought it was fair to say early. Mr. Rowan, she picked up her spoon, then set it down again. I have met 3 men in 3 different towns who decided within the hour that my leg made me unsuitable for the life they were offering. One of them left me a note with the station master rather than look me in the face. I am sitting in this restaurant with you because your letter said you were looking for a steady woman and not a perfect one. If you are telling me you are quiet, I can survive quiet. Quiet is fine. He looked at her for a moment. Then something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, more like the suggestion that a smile was possible. Fair enough, he said. May brought the soup. Elena ate. It was not remarkable soup. As Caleb had implied, nothing here was remarkable, but it was hot, and there was plenty of it, and that was enough. Yeah, they talked a little, not much. He told her the ranch was about 8 miles out of town, that he'd had it 12 years, that he ran cattle and kept a small hay operation. He told her his daughter was 7 and her name was Nora, and that she'd been asking questions about Elena for 2 weeks straight since he'd mentioned a woman might be coming. He paused before mentioning the son. My boy's 12, Thomas. Another pause. He's a hard one to read. He was close with his mother. How long ago did she pass? 2 years this March. And he is still. Caleb turned his coffee cup in his hands. He doesn't talk about it, just carries it. I don't push him. Elena nodded slowly. She understood carrying things. She understood not being pushed and not pushing. I won't push him either, she said. Caleb nodded. Like that was exactly what he needed to hear, and he wasn't going to make a production of it. Outside, the first snow had started, small and half-hearted, ticking against the window glass. The wagon ride out to the ranch took nearly 2 hours. The road, such as it was, cut across open land and then through a stretch of pine that blocked the wind and then back out into the open again. Elena sat on the bench beside Caleb with her suitcase wedged between her feet, her coat buttoned to the throat, watching the landscape do its cold, slow thing around her. He was quiet, as promised. It wasn't an unfriendly quiet. He kept the horse at an even pace and occasionally pointed out things. That ridge, he said, was where the land changed from open range to his property. That line of trees along the creek bed was where the water ran even in dry summers. She paid attention. She had always paid attention. Attention was what you had when you didn't have much else. "Can I ask," she said at one point, "why you put the advertisement?" He was quiet for a moment. Just the sound of the horse, the creak of the wagon. "Nora needs a woman in the house," he said. "That's the honest start of it. And the rest of it," he stopped, started again. "I can manage the ranch. I can manage the children well enough, though Thomas would tell you otherwise. But there are things I'm not good at. Things that need a different kind of steadiness than I have. I'm not looking for someone to fix everything. I know what I'm asking is hard." She looked at the side of his face. He was watching the road. "What happened to your wife?" She said it carefully, not sure if it was too much. "Fever," he said. "Came on fast. 48 hours and she was gone." His jaw worked. "Nora was 5. Didn't really understand. Thomas understood too well." He glanced at her briefly. "You didn't ask anything you shouldn't. I don't mind the question." She nodded. The snow had thickened by the time they turned down the final stretch of road toward the ranch. Elena could see the house through the darkness, lamplight in 2 windows, a low farmhouse with a porch and a barn set back behind it, and smoke coming from the chimney in a thin white line against the black sky. Someone had left the lamps on. Nora appeared on the porch before the wagon had fully stopped. A small, wild-haired shape in a too large coat, hopping from foot to foot in the cold. "She's here! Papa, she's here! I can see her! Is that her?" "Nora." Caleb's voice was firm but not sharp. "Get back on the porch. It's cold." "I'm on the porch." "The edge of it's still the porch," she was saying, but she had retreated a step, and she was staring at Elena with huge dark eyes that held exactly 0 shyness and approximately 1,000,000 questions. Caleb jumped down and took the horse's bridle. Elena climbed down on her own. She had learned how to manage wagon steps over years of necessity, and turned to face the girl. "You're Elena," Nora announced. "I know, because Papa showed me your photograph." "That's right. You're prettier than in the photograph." "Nora," Caleb started. "I'm not saying anything wrong," Nora said seriously. "It's a compliment. Miss Voss, do you know how to braid hair? Papa can't braid hair. He tried once and it looked like something a raccoon did." Elena blinked. Then, very quietly, she laughed. A real one, unplanned, the kind that surprised her. "Yes," she said. "I know how to braid hair." Nora's face split into the most uncomplicated smile Elena had seen in years. "Okay. You can stay." Thomas was in the kitchen when they came inside. He was sitting at the table with a book, and he looked up when the door opened, and his face went through something complicated very quickly before settling into a careful blankness. He was 12, but he looked older. Same build as his father, same stillness. But where Caleb's stillness was settled, Thomas's had an edge to it, a held quality, like a door that was latched from the inside. "Thomas, this is Miss Voss," Caleb said. Thomas looked at her. "Hello?" His voice was flat. Not rude, exactly. More like he had decided to be minimally civil and not 1 degree more. "Hello, Thomas." She didn't offer her hand. She didn't say nice to meet you because it was clearly not an emotion he was prepared to share. She just said his name back at him and looked at him straight, and then she turned to set her coat on the hook by the door. She heard him go back to his book. Caleb caught her eye across the kitchen. She gave a small shrug. "It's fine." He nodded. The house was plain but clean. The kitchen was warm. Someone, Caleb presumably, had put a pot of something on the stove that smelled like beans and salt pork, and there was a lamp burning on the table and another on the windowsill, and the whole effect, however simple, was the effect of a place that was trying to be lived in, even though something important had been taken out of it. Elena stood in the middle of the kitchen and felt the specific ache of that. Not her own grief, but a second-hand grief. The ghost of a woman she'd never known who had stood in this same spot and made it into something and then been gone. She picked up her suitcase. Where should I? Room off the back hall, Caleb said. I'll show you. But the room was small. A window that looked out on the barn, a bed with a blue quilt, a chest of drawers, a single hook on the wall. There was a rag rug on the floor that someone had made by hand. The colors faded, but the work still solid. Caleb set the lamp on the chest of drawers and stood in the doorway. It's not much, he said. It is enough. She meant it. He nodded. He seemed about to leave, then stopped. Miss Voss, I know this is strange. Coming to a place you don't know, people you don't know. I know it's a lot to ask. He looked at the floor, then back at her. I just want you to know, I'm not going to make this harder than it has to be. She looked at him for a moment. A man who didn't make promises he couldn't keep. A man who told you up front he was quiet. A man whose daughter had declared her welcome in 30 seconds and whose son was going to need months or maybe longer. A situation that was going to be hard in all the ordinary ways and several extraordinary ones. Thank you, she said, for not leaving a note with the station master. Something flickered behind his eyes. Not confusion, recognition. He understood what that meant, or enough of it. Go on and rest, he said quietly. Breakfast is early. He left. She heard his boots on the hallway floor, then the low murmur of his voice and Nora's much less low response from somewhere in the front of the house. Elena stood alone in the small room and looked at her suitcase. She did not unpack it. She never unpacked. Not anymore. It was easier to keep everything ready, for the next train, the next platform, the next man's face when he saw her walk. She sat on the edge of the bed instead, pressed her palms against her knees. Outside, the snow had started in earnest. She could hear it against the glass, a soft, insistent sound, the sound of a world covering itself over. She was still here. For now, she was still here. The first morning on the ranch, Elena woke before anyone else. She lay still for a moment in the unfamiliar dark, listening to the sounds of a house that wasn't hers. The low creak of settling wood, the wind pressing against the window glass, somewhere outside the shift and stamp of the horse in the barn. Her left leg ached dully from the cold that came up through the floorboards. She pulled the blue quilt tighter and stared at the ceiling and tried to remember where she was. Montana. Harlan Creek. Caleb Rowan's ranch. She was still here. She dressed in the dark, the way she had learned to dress in boarding houses where other women were sleeping nearby. Quietly, efficiently, without fuss. When she came out into the hallway, the kitchen was cold and gray and entirely empty. The lamp on the table burned down to nothing. She found wood stacked beside the stove. She found matches on the shelf above it. She had the fire going and water heating before she heard the first boot step in the hallway. Caleb stopped in the kitchen doorway. He was fully dressed, but his hair was uncombed and he looked like a man who had not yet made peace with being awake. He looked at her. He looked at the fire. He looked at the pot of water. You didn't have to do that, he said. I was up, she said. Is there coffee? He crossed to a cabinet she hadn't opened yet and pulled out a tin. He measured the coffee without speaking, and she stepped aside to give him room at the stove, and they moved around each other in the small kitchen with the careful coordination of two people who don't know each other's rhythms yet, but are both trying not to make it awkward. It was, in fact, a little awkward, but less than she had expected. Nora came in at full speed 20 minutes later, hair everywhere, one boot on and one boot in her hand, demanding to know if Elena was still there. The question landed with a weight Nora probably didn't understand, still there, as if she'd half expected another disappearance in the night. And Elena looked up from the oatmeal she'd started and said yes, she was still there. Good, Nora said, dropped into a chair and started wrestling with her boot. Thomas came in last. He sat down at his usual spot, the chair closest to the door, and accepted the oatmeal Elena set in front of him with a single nod that meant nothing warmer than acknowledgement. He ate looking at the table. Elena didn't try to pull conversation out of him. She had learned a long time ago that the fastest way to lose ground with a closed person was to push at the door. Caleb drank his coffee standing up, the way Elena suspected he always did, looking out the window at the sky. Snow held off, he said to no one in particular. I'll take it. That was breakfast. The days took on a shape slowly, the way things do when a new element is introduced into an established system, and everything has to find a way to settle around it. Caleb was out of the house before full light most mornings, back at midday briefly, then out again until dark. He was not neglectful. He was simply a man whose work was the land, and the land required most of him. He had built this life on a framework of necessity and stubbornness and not much else, and Elena could see the edges of how hard it was to hold together. The barn that needed a new board on the south wall, the fence along the creek that was leaning but not yet down, the stack of mending in the corner of the front room that had grown into something architectural. She started on the mending the second day without asking. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She simply needed something to do with her hands, and the mending was there, and it was the kind of work she understood. She sat in the front room in the afternoon light and worked through the pile methodically. Thomas's torn jacket, a pair of Nora's wool stockings with a hole the size of a silver dollar in the heel, a flannel shirt of Caleb's that had given out at the elbow seam. Nora sat across from her and watched with the focused attention of a child who finds everything interesting. "How do you do that so fast?" Nora asked. "Practice." Elena pulled the thread through. "I used to work in a textile mill. You learn to be fast or you fall behind." "What's a textile mill?" "A place where they make fabric, cloth, very loud, very warm in summer, very cold in everything else." Nora considered this. "Did you like it?" "No." "Then why did you do it?" Elena glanced up at her, 7 years old and already asking the questions that cut straight to the bone. "Because it was the work that was available," she said simply. "Sometimes you do the work that's there and you save your money and you wait for something better." Nora seemed to find this reasonable. She sat quietly for approximately 40 seconds, which was her limit. "Elena, do you think Thomas will like you eventually?" Elena kept her eyes on the sewing. "I don't know. That's up to Thomas. I could talk to him." "Please don't." "I'm very persuasive," Nora said seriously. "I believe you, and I'm asking you not to." Elena looked up then. "Some things take time and can't be pushed. If you push them, they break. Do you understand?" Nora thought about it. Then she nodded, slowly, the way a child does when they're making a genuine effort to take something seriously. "Like the cat," she said. "The barn cat. Papa said if you chase her, she runs away, but if you sit still, she comes to you." "Exactly like the cat," Elena said. What she had not told Nora, what she had not told anyone, was that she still hadn't unpacked her suitcase. It sat in the corner of her room, still closed, and every morning she opened her coat and hung it on the single hook, and every evening she took it back down. She wore the same rotation of clothes she had arrived with. She found, after a week, a drawer that was empty in the chest, and she stood in front of it for a full minute before she closed it again and walked out of the room. It wasn't stubbornness, it was survival logic, built up over years of being somewhere until she was asked to leave it. You didn't plant yourself somewhere you might be uprooted from. You kept your roots pulled up and close until the ground proved itself. She cooked. She cleaned. She helped Nora with the reading lessons that the girls' last winter schooling had left half-finished. She was useful, and being useful was something she knew how to do, and it kept her from thinking too much about whether useful was enough. The town was another matter. She went in with Caleb the following Saturday for supplies, and the way people looked at her told her everything about what they thought of the arrangement. Some of them were simply curious. A new face in a small town, nothing unusual about staring. But there was another kind of looking, the kind that traveled from her face to her leg, and then to Caleb, and then back again. And that look had a specific flavor she recognized. It was the look of people doing arithmetic, calculating what someone like her was doing standing next to someone like him, and coming up with answers she wasn't included in. A woman outside the dry goods store, broad-shouldered, capable-looking, the kind of woman who seemed to run several things simultaneously, gave Elena a long look and then said to Caleb, in a friendly tone that wasn't entirely friendly, "Is this the woman from the advertisement, Caleb?" "This is Miss Elena Voss," Caleb said. His voice was even. "How do you do?" Elena said. The woman, whose name, Elena learned later, was Ruth Halston, looked at her with the particular attention of someone who was filing information for future use. "Well," she said, "I hope you find the ranch suits you." The way she said it implied she doubted it would. In the wagon on the way home, Elena sat with the supplies stacked around her feet and said, without looking at Caleb, "She doesn't think I'll stay." "Ruth Halston doesn't think much stays that she doesn't approve of first," Caleb said. He kept his eyes on the road. "Don't let it bother you." "It doesn't bother me," Elena said. which wasn't quite true, but it was the truest version she was willing to share. He glanced at her sideways. He seemed to understand the gap between what she'd said and what she'd meant. He didn't push at it. He just said she was a friend of Margaret's, and that explained both Ruth Halston's loyalty and her skepticism, and they left it at that. Margaret was the name he never used otherwise. Margaret was the name carved, Elena knew, on a wooden marker at the edge of the ranch's east field, which she had found one morning while walking and had stood at for a moment and then quietly moved away from. 3 weeks in, Thomas spoke to her for the first time beyond one-word answers. It happened in the barn, which was where she had taken to going in the late afternoons when her leg ached too much for housework, and she needed somewhere to sit that wasn't a chair inside a house that still felt borrowed. She would bring mending, or sometimes nothing at all, and sit on a bale of hay and let the sound and smell of the animals settle around her. She didn't hear Thomas come in. She was working a knot out of a piece of harness leather, her bad leg stretched out in front of her, and she looked up and he was just there, on the other side of the barn, pretending to check on something in the corner. She went back to the harness. After a while he said, without turning around, "Why do you come out here?" "Quiet," she said. "The house is quiet. Different kind of quiet." She kept working the leather. "And there it's a house quiet. Out here it's something else." He turned around then. He leaned against the wall with his arms crossed, the posture of someone trying to look unbothered. His face was his father's face, but with more feelings running across the surface of it, not yet learned how to still them. "You're not going to stay," he said. She looked up at him. "What makes you say that?" "Nobody stays." He said it like a fact, flat and already proven. She considered him for a moment. She could give him something comfortable. She could say, "Of course I'll stay. Things will be wonderful." She had been given those kinds of words before and knew what they were worth. "I don't know yet if I'll stay," she said instead. "That's honest. What I do know is I'm not leaving because of anything wrong with you or your sister or your father. I'm still here because this place has been decent to me, and I intend to be decent back for as long as I'm here." He looked at her with a kind of guarded surprise, like he'd expected something softer and wasn't sure what to do with what he'd gotten. "My mother would have liked you," he said. Then immediately, something locked up in his face. He hadn't meant to say it, she could see that, and now he didn't know what to do with having said it. He turned back to the corner. "The bay mare's shoe is loose," he said in a completely different voice. "I was going to tell Papa." "You should tell him tonight," Elena said. Her voice was the same as it had been before. She didn't make anything of what he'd said about his mother. She just moved past it gently, the way you move past a bruised thing without pressing. Thomas left the barn without saying anything else, but he had said what he said, and they both knew it. But Caleb noticed the change, even if he didn't say anything directly. He noticed most things she was learning. He simply processed them quietly and revealed them slowly, in his own time, like a man who had been burned enough times by speaking too fast that he'd made a habit of waiting. One evening after supper, when the children were in their rooms and the kitchen was cleaned and the fire was banked, he came in from one last check on the barn and found her sitting at the table with a cup of tea gone cold, looking at nothing. He sat down across from her. He didn't say anything for a minute, then, "You look tired." "I am tired," she said. "It's nothing unusual." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Is it the leg? Worse in the cold?" She glanced at him. The question surprised her, not because it was intrusive, but because it was the first time in 3 weeks anyone had named it, without either discomfort or pity. Just a practical question about a practical fact. "Yes," she said, "when it's cold and damp both. The cold alone isn't so bad." He nodded. "There's a room off the kitchen, other side of the wall, better insulated, smaller, but warmer." He paused. "It was a storage room. I could clear it out." "My room is fine." "I'm not saying it isn't. I'm saying the other one is warmer." She looked at him. He was not offering it to be kind, or not only to be kind. He was offering it the way he offered most things, plainly, with a practical justification, without performance. "I'll think about it," she said. He nodded, drank the last of his coffee, and stood up. "Good night, Miss Voss." "Good night." He paused at the doorway. "Elena." It was the first time he had used her name directly. "Whatever Thomas said to you in the barn, I could see it meant something. I don't know what it was, and you don't have to tell me, but—" He stopped. Something shifted in his face. He doesn't talk to people. He hasn't since Margaret. So whatever you did or didn't do, it helped. She didn't say anything. There wasn't much to say. He went to bed. She sat at the table a while longer, her cold tea in both hands, listening to the house settle into sleep around her. The wind had picked up outside, knocking at the windows with the specific insistence of a Montana night that wanted to remind you how exposed you were out here, how far from anything, how much of survival was just a decision to keep the fire going. The fire was still going. She got up and put another log on it. Then she went to bed. The weeks accumulated. She learned that Nora had nightmares sometimes and would appear in the kitchen at 2 a.m, silent and wide-eyed, wanting nothing more than someone to sit with. Elena sat with her. She learned that Thomas ate more than anyone gave him credit for, and that he would, if the food was something he liked, eat 3 servings without comment, which she took as a form of endorsement. She learned that Caleb was up at 4:30, regardless of the season, that he mended his own equipment before he asked anyone for help, and that he sang very quietly to himself sometimes when he thought no one could hear. Old songs. She didn't know what they were, but they were in a low, steady voice, and they made the barn feel less cold. She did not tell him she could hear him. Some things were allowed to stay private. What she also learned, more slowly and without quite meaning to, was the shape of what this family had lost. It was not dramatic. It showed up in small gaps, the unfinished things, the hesitations, the way Nora sometimes stopped mid-sentence and said, "Mama used to," and then didn't finish. The way Caleb's eyes went a specific direction when he was in the East Field and he thought no one was watching. The way Thomas handled certain objects in the house, a particular mug, a blue ceramic bowl, with an almost unconscious care, as though they were something breakable in a way that had nothing to do with ceramic. A woman had lived here, had loved these people, had made this place into something, and then had been taken from it too fast for anyone to prepare. Elena was not that woman. She was never going to be that woman, and she did not try to be. She did not rearrange the furniture or replace the curtains or suggest that the blue bowl belonged somewhere other than where it had always been. She moved into the spaces that were empty and left the rest alone. It was not a natural thing, finding the balance. She misjudged it sometimes. She overstepped once, suggesting a change to the kitchen organization that she immediately saw, from the look on Caleb's face, was an overreach. She backed off. He didn't make an issue of it. But she felt it for 2 days. The sense that she had pressed somewhere she shouldn't have, and she was more careful after. The town did not warm to her quickly. This she had expected. She went in with Caleb twice more in the first month, and each time Ruth Halston found a reason to be in her line of sight. And each time there were women whose conversations changed slightly when Elena was nearby. She was foreign. She was imperfect in a visible way. She was living in a dead woman's house and raising a dead woman's children, and that, to certain people, was a trespass that no amount of decent behavior would fully correct. She did not have the luxury of not caring, but she had years of practice at not letting it show. She kept her chin level and her voice even, and she said good morning to everyone who merited it, and she let the rest go as much as she was able. One afternoon outside the dry goods store, she was loading flour into the wagon when she heard it. 2 women, around the corner, not quite low enough. "Heard she can't have children. That's why the others sent her back." Well, she had to end up somewhere, didn't she? The flour sack was heavy. She set it in the wagon bed without letting it drop, squared her hands against the wood, and breathed. 1 breath. 2. She had heard worse. She had survived worse. She finished loading the wagon. When Caleb came out of the store, she was already on the bench, hands folded in her lap, face composed. "Ready?" he asked. "Ready," she said. He looked at her for a moment, that careful, seeing look he had, and she could tell he suspected something had happened, but he also, to his credit, understood that this was not the moment. He climbed up beside her and took the reins. They drove out of town without speaking. The sky was low and gray, and the mountains in the distance had disappeared behind a wall of cloud. Elena watched the land pass and thought about what the women had said, turning it over with the same methodical patience she brought to everything, taking it apart to see what it was actually made of. The truth was, they weren't wrong about the fact. 3 doctors over 9 years had told her, in 3 different ways, the same thing. Her body had been through something early, and the aftermath had closed certain doors. She had grieved it. She had finished grieving it. It was just a fact now, like her leg, like her accent. A thing about her that she could not change and had decided to carry without letting it be the most important thing about her. But someone had said it loud enough for anyone to hear, and it would go through this town like all things went through a small town, fast and changed at every telling. She would not let it break her. She had made a practice of not letting things break her. "The west fence needs work," Caleb said out of nowhere as they came around the bend toward home. "Thomas was going to help me tomorrow, if the weather holds." "I'll have something hot when you come in," she said. He glanced at her, small acknowledgement. "That'd be good." And the ranch came into view around the tree line, the lamp already on in the kitchen because Nora was home from school, the smoke climbing out of the chimney, the barn dark and solid against the dimming sky. And Elena looked at all of it and felt something she almost didn't recognize because it had been so long. Not happiness exactly. Something quieter. The sensation of a thing that might, given time, become home. Not because it was easy, not because it was hers, but because she was still in it, still here, still choosing, every morning, to stay. She had not unpacked her suitcase, but she was thinking about it. The thinking about it lasted another 2 weeks, and then one Tuesday morning, Elena opened the drawer in the chest of drawers and put her extra blouse in it. That was all. One blouse. She stood there looking at it for a moment, then closed the drawer and went to make breakfast. She didn't announce it. She didn't mark it in any way. But the suitcase was a little lighter after that, and she was aware of it all day the way you're aware of a stone you finally put down after carrying it so long you forgot it was in your hand. Nora noticed, because Nora noticed everything that happened in a 10-foot radius of her attention. "You put something in the drawer," she said, appearing in the doorway of Elena's room that evening with the barn cat tucked under one arm. The cat had decided, without ceremony, about a week ago that Elena was acceptable, and had communicated this by sitting on her feet every morning while she built the fire. "I did," Elena said. "Does that mean you're staying?" Elena looked at her. The girl's face was trying very hard to be casual and not quite getting there. "It means I put a blouse in a drawer," Elena said. "Give me a little more time." Nora accepted this with more grace than Elena had expected. She set the cat down, and the cat went immediately to Elena's feet. "Okay," Nora said. "But I want you to know that I already told Susanna Heller at school that you live here, so it would be complicated to explain if you left." Elena looked down at the cat on her feet and pressed her lips together to keep from smiling. "Then I'll try not to make things complicated for you with Susanna Heller." Nora nodded, satisfied, and disappeared. It was the first time Elena had said anything that implied staying. She wasn't sure she'd meant to, but she had, and the words had left her mouth, and the roof had not fallen in. She took that as a reasonable sign. Geese. October arrived with the particular cold authority of a Montana autumn that has decided it is done being gentle. The days shortened fast, the light going thin and pale by 4 in the afternoon, the nights dropping well below freezing and leaving a crust of ice on the water barrel that Caleb broke every morning with the back of an axe. The ranch work shifted with the season. Caleb and Thomas were outside more, not less, moving cattle to the lower pasture, reinforcing the barn for winter, cutting and stacking the last of the firewood in a row against the south wall of the house that grew by degrees into something reassuring. Elena watched the woodpile grow and felt, for the first time in a long time, the specific comfort of preparation, of a household getting itself ready for hard weather instead of being caught by it. She and Thomas had found, in the weeks since the barn conversation, a kind of working arrangement. Not friendship, not yet, maybe not for a long time, but something functional and honest, which she valued more than a warmth that would have been forced. He talked to her when he needed to. He did not avoid her. When she asked him to pass something at the table, he did it without the previous flat-faced silence. Once, she caught him laughing at something Nora said, and the laugh was unguarded and quick, and it crossed his whole face before he could pull it back, and she saw, in that half-second, exactly what he must have looked like before he learned to hold himself so carefully. She didn't say anything about it. She just handed him the biscuits and let the moment be what it was. Caleb remained Caleb, steady and quiet and present in the way of someone who shows up rather than speaks up. He had a habit, she'd noticed, of being in whatever room she was working in without making a point of it. He would come in to check something, fix something, get something, and somehow stay a little longer than the task required. She did not examine this too closely. She simply noted it the way she noted most things about him, cataloging it alongside the singing in the barn and the way he looked at his children when they didn't know he was looking, with an expression that was worn down from worry, but still, underneath, unmistakably love. She was not in love with him. She was not going to pretend to something she wasn't certain of. But she was. Aware of him. In a way she hadn't been aware of the other three men, who had been strangers she was hoping to make into something. Caleb was already something. She was just only beginning to understand what. The storm came on a Thursday. She felt it before she could see it. That particular pressure in the air, the way the horses shifted in the barn, the way her left leg ached from knee to ankle with a deep, specific throb that had, over the years, proven itself a reliable weather instrument. She mentioned it at breakfast, as a practical matter. "Something bad tonight," she said, looking at the sky through the kitchen window. "The leg doesn't lie." Caleb looked up from his coffee. He had long since stopped treating her leg as a thing to be navigated around in conversation. He just took the information at face value. "How bad?" "I don't know, but the pressure is wrong. The air feels heavy." He nodded slowly. "I've got cattle in the far north pasture. I was going to leave them another week, but..." "Don't," she said. It came out more definite than she intended. She softened it. "I'd move them today." He looked at her for another moment. Then he pushed back from the table. "Thomas, you're with me today." Thomas looked up from his plate. Whatever objection had been sitting in his 12-year-old face, he had planned something, she could tell, probably something with the bay mare who he'd been spending careful time with. He weighed it and set it down. "Yes, sir." They left after breakfast. Nora went to school on the wagon with the neighbor's boy, as she did Tuesdays and Thursdays. Elena watched the sky through the morning and did not like what she saw. By noon, the clouds to the northwest were the color of old iron, and the wind had picked up with a sound that wasn't quite the usual wind. She built the fire up higher than usual. She put water on to heat. She made sure the lamp oil was full. She did these things without quite knowing why. Not panic, just the preparation instinct that had gotten her through enough hard things that she trusted it more than she trusted words. At 2 o'clock, Nora wasn't home. She was never late on Thursdays. Elena stood on the porch and looked down the road and told herself there were a dozen explanations. The neighbor had been delayed. The horse had thrown a shoe. Children were unpredictable. She stood there for 5 minutes, and then she heard it. Not hoofbeats, but the sound of small boots running, and then Nora came around the bend in the road at a dead sprint, alone, her coat unbuttoned and her face flushed wrong, not with cold, but with something else. Elena was off the porch before she thought about it, bad leg and all, meeting her halfway down the path. "Nora, I walked," Nora gasped. "Danny's wagon threw a wheel. His papa said to wait, but it started to snow, and I..." She stopped. Her face was very bright, and she was breathing in a strange way, not the breathlessness of running, but something more effortful, each breath seeming to cost more than it should. "Elena, I feel..." And then Elena heard it. Under the words, under the ragged breathing, a sound she recognized from something buried very deep in her memory. Her younger brother, a winter in Bratislava, a night their mother had burned everything burnable in the house to keep the room warm enough. A tightness in the chest, a croup, or something like it, and in a child who'd been running in cold air, already worked up and breathing hard. "Come inside," she said. Her voice was steady. She had made a decision somewhere below conscious thought, the way you do in moments that don't give you time to deliberate. "Right now, come." She got Nora inside and sat her by the fire. The girl's lips had a faint blue tinge that turned Elena's blood cold. Her breath was high and thin, and each exhale had a sound in it, a bark, a whistle, that was wrong, mechanically wrong, the sound of an airway fighting itself. Elena put her hand on Nora's forehead, hot. Already hot. "Can you breathe?" She kept her voice calm. Calm was everything right now. "A little," Nora said. "It's..." She stopped to work at a breath. "It's tight." "I know. Don't talk. Just breathe slow." The storm hit the house at that exact moment. Not gradually, the way storms usually arrived, but all at once. A wall of wind and snow that shook the windows and dropped the temperature in the kitchen by what felt like 10 degrees in the span of a minute. Elena did not look at the window. She was already moving. She had no medicine. She had no doctor. The doctor in Harlan Creek was 8 miles of storm away and might as well have been on the moon. What she had was a cast iron kettle, a fire, and a piece of knowledge from another winter, another sick child, another woman who had stood in a cold house and done the only thing available: steam, cold air, alternating to bring down the swelling in the throat. Her mother's voice from somewhere 20 years back. In and out. Hot, then cold. Keep them moving between. Don't let them panic. The panic makes it worse. Thomas, she said, and then remembered. Thomas was with Caleb, in the north pasture, miles away. She was alone. The fact settled into her like a stone into water. Not paralysis, but weight. The specific weight of being the only one responsible. She had felt it before, in other forms. She had felt it every time she'd stepped off a train alone, every time a door had closed, every time she'd had to be enough because there was no one else. She had always been enough. She had to be enough now. Nora, I need you to sit here and breathe slow. I'm going to be right here. I am not going anywhere. Do you hear me? Nora nodded. Her eyes were large and frightened, but she was trying. She could see the child trying to hold on to Elena's calm the way you hold on to a rope. Good girl, stay with me. She got the kettle going, full and on the high flame. She dragged Nora's chair close to the stove where the steam would hit her face when the kettle started. Then she went to the back door and opened it. The wind slammed her sideways and the cold hit her like a wall. And she held it open for a count of 10, letting the brutal cold air rush into the kitchen. And then she shut it and pulled Nora's chair back near the stove. Breathe this, she said. The cold helps open it. The steam helps too. We go back and forth. It hurts, Nora said. Each word was small and effortful. I know. Breathe anyway. In and out. Hot, then cold. The kettle screamed when it hit full boil, and Elena tilted it carefully so the steam rose into Nora's face and the girl flinched from the heat, and then, slowly, took a breath that was slightly less wrong than the last one. Elena counted. Back to the cold. Counted again. Back to the heat. The storm outside had turned the windows white. Elena could not think about where Caleb was, or whether he could get back. She could only think about the next breath. On the 4th cycle, she heard the front door open. Not Caleb. The step was wrong, lighter, uncertain. Thomas appeared in the kitchen doorway, snow-covered and wild-eyed, his coat soaked through. He had come back ahead of his father, who had sent him when the storm blew in, and he had ridden that bay mare 8 miles through a blizzard. And he stood there now, in the kitchen doorway, taking in his sister's heaving chest and Elena's steady movements between the stove and the cold, and his face went white. What's wrong with her? Croup were close to it, Elena said, without breaking her rhythm. She needs air. Help me. What do I do? When I open the door, hold it. Hold it steady against the wind and count to 10 with me. Can you do that? She looked at him directly, not asking permission, not softening it, just, can you do this? And she watched something happen in his face. The fear didn't leave, but something rose through it, pushed up by necessity, by her steadiness, by the simple fact of being needed. Yes, he said. Good. Come here. He crossed the kitchen and stood at the back door beside her. She put her hand on the latch. Ready? He set his jaw. He put his shoulder to the door. Ready. She opened it. The wind tore in, and he braced against the frame and held it. She could see every muscle in his 12-year-old arms shaking with the effort, and she counted aloud and watched Nora breathe the frozen air and watched the blue in her lips begin, fraction by fraction, to recede. When she reached 10, Thomas pulled the door shut and they went back to the steam. Back and forth, over and over. Elena counted. Thomas counted with her. Nora breathed. It was not a clean or a triumphant process. Nora cried at some point, quietly, from exhaustion or fear or both. And Elena held her face in both hands and said, I know, you're doing well. Keep going. Nora kept going. Thomas burned his hand slightly on the kettle handle in the second hour, and Elena wrapped it with a strip of cloth without stopping the rhythm. And he never mentioned the pain, just kept holding the door. At some point she realized she was talking, not to Nora, or not only to Nora, but in a low, steady stream of words that was partly instruction and partly just sound, the sound of someone present, Someone not leaving, someone who was going to stay in this kitchen until this was resolved one way or another. She didn't know what she was saying. Something about breathing, something about being strong, something probably that sounded like her mother. The attack broke just after midnight. She heard it happen, felt it, really, the way you feel a storm break when the pressure in the air suddenly shifts. Nora took a breath, and it was just a breath, just a regular breath, not that horrible, effortful working thing, and she took another, and the sound in her chest had gone quiet, and her lips had gone from blue to pale to the ordinary pink-white of a tired child. Thomas sat down on the floor. He just sat down, knees up, back against the wall, and stared at nothing for a minute. He had been standing for hours. He was 12, and he had held a door open against a blizzard with his burned hand and counted to 10 more times than Elena could track. And now he sat on the floor and his face went through something she did not have a name for, something between relief and exhaustion, and something else, older, that shouldn't have been on a boy's face. "She's okay," Elena said. She said it to him specifically, not to the room, to him. He looked up at her. He nodded. His jaw was working. "You did well," she said. "You did very well, Thomas." He looked away, but he didn't argue. Elena pulled a blanket off the back of the chair and draped it over Nora, who had fallen half asleep against the back of her chair with a trust so complete it hurt to look at it. She tucked the edges around the girl's feet and stayed there, kneeling on the floor for a moment, one hand on Nora's knee, just breathing. Her leg was in serious pain from hours of moving on cold floors. She hadn't noticed until now. Caleb came in at first light. She heard the horse before she heard him, the familiar sound of hooves on frozen ground, then silence, then boots on the porch steps, then the door. She was at the stove, starting coffee, and she turned when she heard him come in. He was snow-covered and hollow-eyed from a night of fighting through the storm, and he was already scanning the room before the door was fully open, looking for his children with the specific terror of a man who had ridden through a blizzard, not knowing what he was coming home to. Nora was asleep on the cot Elena had pulled to the warmest corner of the kitchen. Thomas was asleep in the chair by the stove, chin on his chest, his burned hand resting on his knee with the cloth wrapping Elena had put on it still in place. Caleb looked at both of them. He looked at Elena. She saw his face change. She had not, in all the weeks of watching him, seen him without his composure. He was not a man who lost his face easily, but it moved now, just briefly, something raw crossing through it, some combination of relief and recognition that was too large for the stillness he usually held it in. "What happened?" he said. It was barely a question. She told him, plainly, in order, the way she did everything. Nora's breathing, the storm, Thomas coming back, the steam and the cold air and the hours in between. When she finished, he was looking at her with an expression she couldn't fully interpret. "She's going to be fine," Elena said. "She needs rest today and warmth, and someone should watch for it coming back, but it broke clean. She's breathing normal." He crossed the kitchen. He looked at Nora for a long moment, touched her forehead, pulled the blanket up an inch. Then he looked at Thomas, at the wrapped hand, and something moved through his jaw. He came back to where Elena was standing. He said, "Elena." She looked up at him. "Thank you." He stopped. She could see him trying to find words big enough for whatever was inside him, and not finding them, because some things don't have words that fit. He tried anyway. I don't know what I would have." "Don't," she said quietly, not unkindly, "just stop there." Because if he finished that sentence, she was going to have to keep her face together against something she wasn't ready for. He stopped. They stood in the kitchen in the gray early light with the fire going, and the children sleeping and the storm worn out against the windows. He was close enough that she could see the exhaustion in his face, and the cold still in his coat, and underneath both of those things, looking at her, something that had not been there before. Something resolved. "There's coffee," she said. He let out a breath. Not quite a laugh, but close. "Yeah," he said. "All right." She poured it. He sat down at the table. She sat across from him, and they drank their coffee in the quiet kitchen while the children slept, and the light came up slowly outside, and the storm finished dying. It was not a triumphant morning. Her leg hurt, and Thomas's hand was burned, and Nora had circles under her eyes, and Caleb looked like a man who had been through something and was still in the middle of processing it. There was nothing clean or perfect about any of it. But the fire was going and everyone was breathing and the coffee was hot. And somewhere in all of that, in the plain, ordinary fact of having made it through the night, something had shifted between the four people in that kitchen that had not existed before. Elena could feel it the way she felt weather, not as a thought, but as a pressure in the air, a change in the season of things. She wrapped both hands around her cup and let the heat come through. He asked her 3 days later. Not the way she might have imagined it, in some other life where things happened cleanly and at the right moment with the right words prepared. It happened in the barn, in the late afternoon, while she was rebandaging Thomas's hand and Caleb was standing nearby pretending to check a harness that didn't need checking. Thomas had submitted to the bandaging with the stoicism of someone who had decided that needing care was acceptable as long as he didn't make anything of it. His hand was healing well. The burn had been superficial, more shock than damage. But Elena changed the dressing every day regardless, and Thomas came and held his hand out every day without being asked, which was its own kind of progress. She was tying off the cloth when Caleb said, without turning around, "I've been thinking." "About what?" she said. A pause. The harness didn't move. "About asking you to stay permanent," he said, "as my wife." Thomas went very still. Elena's hand stopped on the knot. The barn was quiet in the way barns get in the late afternoon. The animals settled, the light going golden through the gaps in the boards, everything held in a kind of suspension. She looked at the back of Caleb's head and then at Thomas, who was looking at his father with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not hostile, not guarded, just waiting, holding his breath the same as she was. Caleb turned around. His face was the way it always was when something mattered to him. More still than usual, which meant more was happening underneath than he was letting out. "I know that's not a small thing," he said. "I know what I'm asking. I know the life here is hard and the people in town aren't—" He stopped, started again. "I'm not asking because of the other night, though that's part of it. I'm asking because I've been watching you for 2 months and I think you're the steadiest person I've ever met. And I think my children are better for knowing you. And I think—" Another stop. He looked like a man who had rehearsed something and now couldn't find any of it. "I think I'd like you to stay." She sat there on the hay bale with Thomas's healed hand still loosely in both of hers and looked at Caleb Rowan in his worn coat in his barn and thought about 3 train platforms, 3 men who had looked at her and done the arithmetic and come up short. She thought about the suitcase in the corner of her room, still mostly packed. She thought about 1 blouse in 1 drawer. "You should know," she said carefully, "what people in town are saying about me." "I've heard it." "And?" His jaw tightened slightly. "And I think what people say in town has very little to do with what happens on this ranch, and I'd like to keep it that way." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Thomas, who was watching her with those eyes that had finally started letting things out. "Thomas," she said, "is this... are you—" "You held her all night," Thomas said. It came out rough, like it cost him something to say it. "When I came in, you were already... You didn't leave her. You didn't..." He stopped. His throat worked. "I know you didn't have to stay. The other one could have gone." He meant his mother. He didn't say it, but they both knew. Elena held very still. The other one had not gone by choice, but Thomas was 12, and grief at 12 is not rational. And she understood, without needing it explained, that part of what he had been carrying for 2 years was the irrational and specific terror that the people you needed most were the kind that left. She understood it because she had carried a version of the same thing. She set his hand down gently. She looked back at Caleb. "Yes," she said. Caleb let out a breath that he had maybe been holding for longer than just this conversation. He nodded once, the way he acknowledged most things that mattered, briefly, without performance, which was somehow more convincing than any declaration. "All right," he said. "Good." Thomas stood up from the bale. He stood there a second, visibly deciding something. Then he walked past Elena toward the barn door and paused and said, without looking back, "I'll tell Nora. She'll just scream if Papa does it." He walked out. They could hear Nora's distant voice somewhere near the house, and they both knew he was right. Elena looked at the empty barn doorway. Then she looked at Caleb. Something was threatening to come loose in her chest. Not grief this time, but something she had less practice with, something that felt dangerously close to relief of the permanent kind. She pressed her palms flat on her knees and breathed through it. She's going to scream anyway, Elena said. Probably, Caleb agreed. From somewhere across the yard came a sound that could only be described as Nora. Down. The wedding was small. A Tuesday in November, the county clerk's office in Harlan Creek, Nora in her best dress, and Thomas in a collar that he'd let Elena straighten exactly once before moving out of reach. It took 11 minutes. Caleb said what he was asked to say in his quiet voice, and Elena said the same, and they signed the papers. And on the wagon ride home, Nora held Elena's hand the entire way and talked about everything except the wedding, which Elena understood was Nora's way of treating it as already decided, already done, already simply a fact of life that did not require further commentary. Thomas rode in the back of the wagon. At one point, on the road, she turned around and he met her eyes and gave a single nod. She gave one back. That was enough. What she had not fully calculated, what she should have, given the 2 months of groundwork the town had already laid, was how fast the marriage would accelerate everything that had been merely murmured before. It took 4 days. She was at May's counter buying thread when she heard it, and this time there was no corner, no pretense of privacy. Ruth Halston was standing in the middle of the store with 2 other women and speaking in the particular voice of someone who wants to be heard without technically being accused of speaking directly. Of course Caleb has his reasons, Ruth was saying. He needed someone for the children. That's practical. I understand practical, but you'd think a man would consider... She stopped when Elena came in. Then, to her credit or her audacity, she did not look away. Elena set her thread on the counter. May, behind it, had gone carefully neutral. Mrs. Halston, Elena said. Mrs. Rowan, Ruth said. The name sounded in her mouth like a question about whether it should be allowed. Elena looked at her directly. She had made a decision somewhere on the walk over without fully forming it consciously. The same way she made all the decisions that mattered, below the level of deliberation, in the part of her that had been managing hard things for 31 years. I know what you think, Elena said. Her voice was even. I know what you've said about me. That I can't have children. That Caleb made a poor choice. That I don't belong in Margaret's house. She let each one sit for a moment. You are not wrong about the first one. The doctors I have seen are fairly consistent on the subject. The second and third are matters of opinion. The store was quiet. May had stopped moving entirely. Ruth Halston's face was complicated. She was not a cruel woman, Elena had concluded. She was a woman who had loved Margaret Rowan and was still grieving her and had decided, in the way that grieving people sometimes do, that the grief entitled her to an opinion on how Margaret's family should be rebuilt. That did not make her right. But it made her human, and Elena was not interested in making enemies of humans when she could help it. I'm not trying to replace her, Elena said more quietly. I know I can't. I know those children loved her, and they should keep loving her. I'm not asking anyone to forget Margaret Rowan. I'm asking to be allowed to be something different, something new, in a house that had a hole in it. That is all. Ruth looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind her eyes. She was my closest friend for 14 years, Ruth said, and it came out different from everything before it. Not a weapon, just a fact. A raw one. I know, Elena said. I'm sorry you lost her. The silence stretched. Then Ruth picked up whatever she had come in to buy, and she walked to the counter without speaking, and she left without saying anything further to Elena or to the other women. It was not reconciliation, but it was something, a temporary ceasefire. Or maybe just the moment when 2 people recognize that they are not, actually, enemies, even if they are not friends. May, from behind the counter, slid the thread across to Elena. Strong backbone, May said, quiet, factual, the same way she said everything. I've had to grow one, Elena said. Nuts. Caleb heard about it from 3 separate people before she told him herself, which she did that evening at the kitchen table after the children were in bed. She laid it out plainly. What Ruth had said, what she had said back, how it had ended. He listened without interrupting, which was his way. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. You didn't have to do that, he said. You could have walked past. Yes, she said. I could have. But you didn't. No. She looked at her hands. I've been walking past things my whole life, Caleb. Every platform, every town, every man who looked at my leg and found me lacking. I walked past all of it because I had no claim to stand on. I have a claim now. She paused. I'm not starting fights, but I'm finished walking past. He was quiet again. But this was his different kind of quiet. Not the absence of something, but the presence of something he was still assembling. Ruth Halston's been in my face about this since the advertisement, he said finally. She came to the ranch in September. Did I tell you that? Elena looked up. No? Told me I was making a mistake, that the children needed someone they could, her words, rely on to be whole. His jaw moved. I asked her to leave. Elena stared at him. You didn't tell me that. Didn't seem useful at the time. He looked at her. I should have. I should have told you I'd already made my decision, and I wasn't looking to be talked out of it. His voice was as flat as always, but there was something underneath it. Not anger, something more personal than that. You're my wife. Whatever's said about you goes through me. I should have made that clear to the town before now. You didn't need to. I know I didn't need to. I wanted to. He said it simply. There's a difference. She held on to that for a moment. The difference between what a person does because they have to and what they do because they have decided to, she understood that distinction. She lived on that distinction. She had come to Harlan Creek the fourth time because she had decided to, not because she had to. She had built a fire every morning because she had decided to. She had stayed. Caleb, she said. I unpacked the suitcase. He looked at her. She met his eyes. All of it? He said. Down to the wire repair on the outside. I used it for the garden twine. Something happened in his face that was as close to open as she had ever seen him. Not a smile exactly, but the full permission of one. Good, he said. The letter arrived on a Wednesday in early December, with a postmark from Chicago and handwriting she had not seen in 4 years, but recognized instantly, the way you recognize something that once scared you. Victor Aldrin. She stood on the porch in the cold with the letter in her hand for a long time without opening it. She knew the handwriting, and she knew the return address. A street in Chicago that she had once, at 26, believed represented the life she was meant to have. And she knew, even before she broke the seal, the broad shape of what it contained. She had met Victor Aldrin at a textile industry event in Pittsburgh 4 years ago. He was from old money and new ambition, and he had spoken to her across a room and seemed, for 6 months, to be a man who looked at her and saw more than the sum of her difficulties. He had been charming and educated and occasionally kind. He had also ultimately been a coward, the kind of man who cares for a woman in private and finds reasons to keep her there, who talks about the future without being willing to be seen with it, who one day stops writing and offers, when pressed, a letter of explanation so carefully worded it could not be called a lie, but contained nothing honest either. She had not thought about Victor Aldrin in more than a year. She went inside and sat at the kitchen table and opened the letter. It was 2 pages. She read it once, quickly. Then she set it down. He had heard she was married somehow. News traveled, even across 1,000 miles, along lines she couldn't always trace. He wrote that he was glad she had found stability. He wrote that he thought of her often. He wrote, in the 3rd paragraph, with the careful language of a man who had been practicing, that he had made mistakes, that he had let his family's expectations override what he actually wanted, that his situation had changed, his father's business had passed to him, he was his own man now, he could make his own choices. He was not asking her to leave Harlan Creek, he wrote. He only wanted her to know that if she were ever unhappy, if she ever found herself in a situation that wasn't what she had hoped, there would be a place for her, a house in Chicago, a comfortable life, everything she had deserved and that he had failed to offer when it mattered. He called it an open door. She sat at the kitchen table and read it a second time, more slowly. Victor Aldrin's letter was very well written. It was sympathetic and self-aware, and it acknowledged fault without being maudlin about it. In another life, in the life of the woman who had stood on those 3 train platforms, it might have been the most important thing she'd read in years. It offered everything she had once thought she wanted: security, refinement, a city with opera houses and warm rooms, and a man who had belatedly decided she was worth claiming. In another life, she thought about Nora's hand in hers on the wagon ride home from the wedding. She thought about Thomas's nod, one nod, weighted like a full sentence. She thought about Caleb's voice saying, "I wanted to," the difference between obligation and decision. She thought about the blouse she'd put in the drawer first, before anything else, because it was the smallest step she could take towards staying, and how even that small step had felt like the bravest thing she'd done in years. She thought about the suitcase, empty now, folded flat and slid under the bed, the wire repair she had cut loose for garden twine. She got up from the table. She went to the stove. She opened the firebox door. She put Victor Aldrin's letter in without reading it a third time. It caught quickly. She watched the pages go from white to brown to a brief bright orange and then to nothing. She closed the door. She went back to making dinner. Caleb came in from the barn 40 minutes later, snow on his coat, and she heard him in the hallway taking his boots off and then coming through to the kitchen. She heard him stop. "Smells like something burned," he said. "I burned a letter," she said. A pause. "From who?" "Someone who offered me a comfortable life in Chicago 4 years too late." She didn't turn from the stove. "I don't need it anymore." The silence behind her was Caleb's thinking silence. She had learned to distinguish them. The comfortable quiet, the considering quiet, the one that meant something was working its way to the surface. "Are you all right?" he said. "Not worried exactly, just asking, leaving room." "Yes," she said, and meant it fully, cleanly, without the complicated underside she usually brought to that answer. She was all right. She was here, in this kitchen that had started to smell like hers, making dinner for people who had started to feel like hers, and the letter was ash. "Dinner's in 10 minutes, she said. "Call the children." She heard him cross the kitchen. She thought he was heading for the hallway, but instead he stopped behind her close, and she heard him rather than saw him. The specific kind of pause that meant something was being measured, decided on, committed to. He put one hand on her shoulder. Not long, just briefly. The way you touch something you're grateful for and don't want to make a speech about. Then he called the children. Nora came in at full volume, as always, Thomas a step behind her, and the kitchen filled with noise and movement and the ordinary chaos of a family assembling itself at the end of the day. And Elena stood at the stove and let it close around her like weather. The good kind, the kind that comes in warm from the south and settles low and stays. She was not without scars. She would never be. The leg that ached in cold weather, and the 3 platforms, and the years of mending other people's things in other people's houses, and the doctors who had said what they said, and Victor Aldrin's 6 months of private wanting that had not been worth one public claim. None of it was erased. None of it was fixed. She was not a woman to whom things had been restored. She was a woman who had kept going anyway, through all of it, because there was no other option that made sense to her. And now she was here, in a kitchen in Montana, with a burned letter in the firebox and a family sitting down to dinner. Nora said, "What are we having?" "Stew," Elena said. "Sit down and stop hovering." "I'm not hovering, I'm looking." "Looking at the pot won't make it faster." "How do you know?" Nora. "Thomas." From the table. "Sit." Nora sat. She gave Thomas a look of profound sisterly offense, which he ignored with the expertise of long practice. Elena brought the pot to the table. Caleb poured the water. Thomas passed the bread. Nora talked about something that had happened at school involving a goat that had gotten into the building, which should have been impossible but apparently wasn't. And the whole story was told at high speed with several dramatic reenactments. And the table was, for the length of it, full of the particular noise that comes when people are comfortable enough with each other to be loud. Elena listened to all of it and ate her stew and did not say very much, which was fine. She did not need to say very much. She was here. She was at the table. The chair she sat in had, without formal announcement, become her chair, the same way the hook by the door had become the hook for her coat, and the drawer in the chest had become the drawer that held her things. Claiming, she had learned, did not always happen in words. Sometimes it happened in the accumulation of small decisions. A blouse in a drawer, a letter in a fire, a chair at a table. She was not done fighting for this. She knew that. The town had not fully made its peace with her. There were women who still looked and men who still calculated, and Ruth Halston, who was still somewhere between grief and stubbornness, deciding what to do with her opinion. There would be more days like the one in May's store. There would be more letters, or their equivalent. More old lives knocking at the door to see if the new one had held. But she was not the woman on the platform anymore. She was not waiting for a stranger's face to tell her whether she was allowed to stay. She had decided to stay. And she had stopped carrying the suitcase. Winter in Montana is not a season so much as a test of character, and Harlan Creek administered it without mercy. December came in hard and stayed that way. Temperatures that dropped below zero by 8 in the evening and didn't recover until well past noon. Snow that fell and compacted and fell again until the fence posts along the road were buried to their midpoints, and the world outside the ranch contracted to whatever you could see from the kitchen window. The isolation was not cruel exactly. It was simply total, the kind that strips everything back to what's essential and makes you take an honest inventory of what that is. For Elena, the inventory had gotten simpler. Fire, food, the children's voices, the sound of Caleb's boots in the hallway. The barn cat, enormous now with winter fat, stationed on her feet every morning with the absolute authority of something that has decided where it belongs. She had stopped monitoring herself for signs of wrongness the way she used to, scanning every interaction for the moment when the floor would give, when a face would change, when a suitcase would need repacking. She did not stop entirely. She suspected she never would, not fully, the way people who have been cold enough times never fully trust warmth. But the monitoring had become background noise instead of the loudest thing in the room. That was enough. That was progress. The ranch ran its winter routine with the mechanical stubbornness of a thing that had no option but to keep going. Caleb broke ice on the water every morning. Thomas had taken over the evening barn check with the quiet pride of a boy who had been given a real responsibility and intended to earn it. Nora did her schoolwork at the kitchen table and asked questions about everything, and accepted most answers as starting points for more questions, which Elena had come to find less exhausting and more, she didn't have a word for it, something like necessary. Like a particular sound you don't notice until it stops. Thomas's hand had healed completely. He did not bring up the night of the storm directly, ever, but it had changed the geometry of how he moved through the house. He was not suddenly open. He was too much his father's son for that, too much himself. But the latched quality was gone from him. The door was still mostly closed, but it was no longer locked from the inside, and that was a different thing entirely. One evening in late December he came into the kitchen while Elena was mending, an old habit she had never lost. The mending pile being apparently a permanent feature of any household with children and a working ranch. And he sat across from her and put a piece of harness leather and a tool on the table between them. "Will you show me how you did that?" he said. He meant the harness repair she had done in September, his father's old rig that she had worked back to usefulness. "Papa says it'll last longer than a new one. I want to learn." She looked at him. He met her eyes with the particular directness he had when he had decided to want something and wasn't going to perform embarrassment about it. "Pull your chair around," she said. He did. She showed him the stitch, the leather worker's stitch, double thread, the kind that holds when everything else gives. And he watched once and then did it himself, badly the first time and less badly the second, and he didn't ask her to tell him it was good. He just looked at it, found it wanting, and did it again. She recognized that in him. It was the same stubbornness she had, the kind that's not about proving anything to anyone else but about meeting your own standard. They worked across from each other for an hour without talking much. It was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of shared quiet that takes a long time to build between people and is, once built, one of the more valuable things available. At some point he said, without looking up from the leather, "I told Nora you were going to stay, back in September. She didn't believe me." Elena kept her eyes on her mending. "What made you think so?" He was quiet for a moment. "You fixed the harness," he said. "The one nobody asked you to fix. You didn't do it to make Papa like you. You did it because it needed doing." He pulled the thread through. "My mother was like that." She held very still. "She did things because they needed doing," he said. "Not because someone was watching." He paused. "I'm not saying you're the same as her. You're not. But that part's the same." He set down the leather and looked at his work. He was not going to look at her, she understood. He had given her what he was able to give, and now he needed the conversation to be done. "Your stitch is good," she said. "The tension's even." He picked it back up. "Show me the knot again." She did. Heat. January brought Ruth Halston to the ranch. Elena saw her coming from the kitchen window. The familiar broad-shouldered silhouette, the dark coat, a covered dish balanced in both hands. And she stood at the window for a moment and took stock of herself, and found that she was not exactly afraid. Wary, maybe. Prepared. The way you are when you've already been through a thing once and know its shape. She opened the door before Ruth could knock. They looked at each other on the porch. "I brought a beef pie," Ruth said. "Margaret's recipe. I thought—" She stopped, recalibrated. "I thought the children might like it." "Come in," Elena said. Ruth came into the kitchen. She set the dish on the table and stood there in her coat, which she had not unbuttoned, which meant she was reserving the right to leave quickly. Elena had done the same thing, on 3 train platforms. She recognized the posture. "Sit down, Mrs. Halston. I'll make coffee." Ruth sat. Elena made coffee. She did not hurry it or make anything of the silence. When she set the cup down, Ruth wrapped both hands around it the way Elena did, which told her something about cold hands being the same everywhere. "I want to say something," Ruth said. "All right. I've been unkind to you." She said it flatly, the way someone says a thing they've been rehearsing long enough to have burned the performance out of it. Not directly, mostly, but in the way I've talked about you to people. And I've been thinking about that. Elena sat across from her. "What made you think about it?" "My youngest saw Nora at the schoolhouse before Christmas break. She said Nora looked like herself again." Ruth stopped. "Nora hasn't looked like herself since Margaret died. I noticed it, but I told myself it was just time. Then my daughter said that thing, and I started thinking about the difference between time and someone actually helping." Elena looked at her coffee. "I miss Margaret every day," Ruth said. "And I think I convinced myself that if you didn't work out, if the children didn't take to you, then somehow Margaret was still—" She stopped. Her jaw worked. "That doesn't make any sense." "It makes sense," Elena said. "You were protecting her, even after." Ruth looked at her then. A real look, not the calculating inventory from before. "You're not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Something either harder or softer." She turned her cup. "You're just practical." "I've had to be." "Yes." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "I was the one who started the talk, about you not being able to have children. I heard it somewhere, and I passed it along. I shouldn't have." She said it like it tasted bad. "It was none of my business, and it was cruel, and I'm sorry for it." Elena held very still. She had carried those 2 women's voices around the corner of the dry goods store, that specific flavor of cruelty, longer than she wanted to admit. Not at the front of her mind, but in the back of it, in the place where things went when you didn't have time to process them, but they didn't go away. "Thank you," she said. She meant it without warmth and without coldness, just received, accepted, filed away. Ruth nodded. She drank her coffee. After a while, she said, "The pie is better warm. Do you have a—" "There's a pan," Elena said, and got up to find it, and they heated the pie. And when the children came in from outside, they descended on it with the absolute lack of ceremony of people who are hungry and not yet old enough to be polite about it. And Ruth Halston watched them eat, and something in her face went soft in a private way, and Elena left her to it. It was not a friendship, not then, but it was the end of something, and sometimes the ending of the wrong thing is as important as the beginning of the right one. She found out in February. She had been tired in a way she couldn't account for. Not the bone-deep exhaustion of winter work, which she knew and had learned to manage, but something different. A persistent low-grade wrongness in her body, like a note that was slightly off-pitch, not painful but noticeable. She had ignored it for 2 weeks, because she had practice at ignoring things her body did that she didn't want to negotiate with. Then Nora asked her, very casually over breakfast, if she was going to be sick again. "I haven't been sick," Elena said. "You look like the Lambert girl looked before she had her baby," Nora said, with the enormous confidence of a 7-year-old delivering medical opinion. "She was green in the mornings, too." Thomas looked up from his plate. He looked at Elena. Then he looked at Nora with an expression that suggested she had potentially opened a door better left for adults to open, and he went back to his plate. Caleb was looking at her. She could feel it without meeting his eyes. She met his eyes. "I don't know," she said, which was honest. She genuinely did not know. The doctors had been consistent, and she had believed them, and she had built her understanding of her life around their consistency. Caleb pushed back from the table. I'll take you into town. Caleb, it's probably... I'll take you into town, he said again. Not forcefully, just as a fact that had already been decided. She let him. Dr. Ambrose was a compact, gray-haired man who had practiced medicine in Harlan Creek for 23 years and had seen enough strange things to have stopped being surprised by most of them. He examined her with the efficient courtesy of someone who understands that the body is a serious matter and doesn't require additional drama from him. Afterward, he sat across his desk from her and folded his hands and said, Mrs. Rowan, I want to be straightforward with you. Please, she said. The doctors you saw before weren't wrong about what they found. What they may have been wrong about is what it meant in the long term. Bodies change. He paused. You are, as far as I can determine, approximately 8 weeks pregnant. She sat in the chair across from his desk and heard the words and did not at first feel anything at all. Then she felt a great deal of things simultaneously, which was difficult to organize, so she focused on one. She focused on keeping her face level. You're certain, she said. In medicine, I'm rarely certain of anything, but I am confident. She looked at the window behind his head. The February sky outside was pale and cloudless, the specific blue of a cold, clear day, the kind that looks warm until you're in it. I was told 3 times, she said, by 3 different doctors. I know. You told me. He was gentle about it, not pitying, just careful. I don't say this to diminish what they found or what you were told. I say it because sometimes... He stopped, looking for the right words. Sometimes the body decides something different than what we've predicted. I've seen it before. Not often, but I've seen it. She nodded once. Her hands were folded in her lap, very still, the way she held herself when something large was moving through her, and she was not yet ready to let it out. Is there risk? She said, given what they found before. There's risk in any pregnancy. I'd want to see you regularly. I'd want you to rest more than you probably do. He looked at her over his desk with the frankness of a man who has seen enough ranch women to know the suggestion was optimistic. I mean it about the rest, Mrs. Rowan. This is not a situation to power through. All right, she said. Caleb was waiting in the wagon. She came out of the office and he looked at her face and he knew immediately that something significant had happened because her face was doing what it rarely did. It was showing everything, right on the surface, without the usual careful management. She climbed up beside him. She sat there. Elena, he said. She turned to look at him. Her eyes were dry. She was not a woman who cried easily or often. She had used that up long ago. But there was something in them, some enormous and not yet organized thing. The doctor says I'm pregnant, she said. The silence that followed was the longest she had ever heard from Caleb Rowan, who was a man fluent in silence. He sat with it for a full 10 seconds, maybe more. His hands were on the reins, but he wasn't moving the horse. Then he said very quietly, How? He says bodies change. He says sometimes... She stopped. Something was coming loose in her chest. He said he's seen it before. Caleb set the reins down. He turned to face her fully. She had only seen him turn to face things fully a handful of times, and each one had mattered. He reached over and took her hand. He held it the way he held things he intended to keep. Not tight, but deliberate. Present. She looked down at their hands, and then she did cry. Just briefly, quietly, the way she cried when she cried at all. Not falling apart, just the release of pressure that had been building behind something for longer than she could track. It lasted maybe 30 seconds. He didn't say anything. He didn't tell her it was all right. He just held her hand. She straightened. She pressed the back of her other hand to her face. The doctor says I have to rest more, she said. Then you'll rest more. I'm not good at resting. I know. He picked up the reins. We'll manage. They drove home in a quiet that was entirely different from any previous quiet. The kind that has something new inside it. Something still taking shape, too early to name properly, but impossible not to feel. Chet. Spring came to the ranch the way it always came to Montana. Not gently, but suddenly, as though the land had simply decided it was done with winter and wasn't consulting anyone about the timeline. The snow pulled back from the south-facing slopes first, revealing the pale, flattened grass underneath. And then the creek ran high with snowmelt, and the mud season arrived in force, thick and unromantic, coating every boot and every animal and every inch of the yard for 3 weeks straight. Elena watched it from the porch some mornings, her coffee in both hands, her coat around her shoulders. Her stomach had begun to show enough that Nora had taken to addressing comments to it directly, which Elena had given up discouraging because Nora was not discourageable. Thomas had responded to the news with a silence that lasted 2 days and then broken it by asking, with great seriousness, whether she needed him to carry things. She had said yes. He had been carrying things ever since, not every time, not performatively, just when the opportunity presented itself. She did not make anything of it. She simply let him. Caleb had told the children in the straightforward way he told them most things. Directly, at dinner, with the facts laid plain and no additional decoration. Nora had received this information as though it were approximately the best news ever delivered in the history of Montana and had immediately begun arguing for a girl. Thomas had looked at his plate. Then he had looked at Elena and nodded, his version of a full declaration. She had nodded back. The mud season gave way to actual spring, the tentative kind with mornings still cold enough to see your breath and afternoons that promised something better. The grass came back. The cattle moved up to the high pasture. The garden plot beside the south wall of the house, which Elena had cleared in the fall and winter prepped with kitchen ash and last year's compost, began showing the first faint green signals of what she'd put into it. Carrots, onions, parsnips, 2 rows of beans that Nora had insisted on planting herself in slightly crooked lines. Ruth Halston came out twice in the spring. The second time she came without the beef pie, which Elena took as a sign that the visit was its own purpose now. They drank coffee and talked about the garden and the coming summer, and at some point Ruth mentioned Margaret briefly, in a tone that had sadness in it, but not the previous edge of ownership. Elena listened and did not flinch from the name and did not try to fill the space around it with anything unnecessary. Margaret Rowan had existed. She had mattered. She had left behind people who loved her and a house she had made into something. None of that was threatened by Elena being in it. She had understood this a long time ago. It had just taken certain other people longer to arrive at the same understanding. One afternoon in April, Elena was in the garden when she heard the wagon coming up the road. Caleb and Thomas back from town, earlier than expected, and Nora came tearing out of the barn where she'd been conducting some project that involved a great deal of straw and at least one unwilling cat, and she came to a stop at the garden fence. "Elena," Nora said, "do you think it'll be a girl?" "I don't know, Nora. I've been thinking about names. You've told me. I have 17 candidates. You've told me that too." Nora leaned on the fence rail and watched Elena work for a moment. Then she said, in a completely different voice, quieter, younger, the voice she used when she wasn't performing, "Are you scared?" Elena looked up at her. The girl's face was serious in the way it got when she had been thinking about something for a while and had finally found the moment to say it. "A little," Elena said. "Honest." "Of what?" She thought about it. "Of wanting something this much," she said. "It's been a long time since I let myself want something this much." Nora considered this with the gravity it deserved. "Papa says you're the bravest person he knows," she said. "He told Thomas. I was listening from the hallway. I wasn't supposed to be, but I was." Elena looked at her daughter. She had been thinking of her that way for a while now. Daughter, not stepdaughter, just daughter. The word arriving quietly one morning without announcement. And the word still had a warmth to it that surprised her sometimes, the way warmth does when you've been cold for a very long time. "What did Thomas say?" Elena asked. "He said he already knew." Nora shrugged. "Thomas always says he already knew everything. It's very annoying." She pushed off the fence rail. "I'm going to go help Papa with the wagon, because Thomas will just stand there looking efficient, and that's boring." She ran off. Elena stood in the garden in the April light, her hands in the dirt, and stayed with that for a moment. Bravest person he knows. She turned it over, looking for the edge where it might be too much, too large, the kind of thing that invites disappointment. She was practiced at finding those edges. But Caleb was not a man who said things he didn't mean. He hadn't said it to her directly. He had said it where he thought she couldn't hear, which meant more, not less. She looked at the crooked rows of beans Nora had planted, the carrots going in straight, the onions that were already showing a half-inch of green, a garden that would feed people through next winter if she tended it right, a house she knew now by every sound and every draft and every board that needed watching. She knew the names of the people in it. She knew how each of them slept and ate and worried and laughed. She knew which silences meant something was wrong and which ones meant everything was fine. She had built that knowledge the way you build everything that matters, slowly, imperfectly, by showing up when it would have been easier not to. She was not the woman from the platform. She was barely able to remember being her, that woman with the worn suitcase and the bitten cheek and the 3 rejections behind her and 1 more ahead, boarding the train to Montana with nothing but the argument that she had no better option and the stubbornness to try anyway. That woman had been brave, braver than she'd given herself credit for. Brave in the specific and unglamorous way of someone who keeps going, not because they believe it will work out, but because stopping is worse. And it had led her here, not to a perfect place. There was mud season and a leg that ached in cold weather, and a town that had taken months to come around, and a pregnancy that 3 doctors had said was impossible, which meant nothing was certain, and the doctor had said as much, and she would not pretend otherwise. There was no version of this life that was without risk. There never had been. But there was Caleb coming around the side of the barn now, saying something to Thomas that made the boy actually laugh. A full laugh, unguarded, the laugh she had seen that once in the kitchen and thought she might not see again. There was Nora's voice carrying across the yard at a volume that respected no boundary. There was the barn cat picking her way along the fence rail with enormous dignity. There was the green smell of April and the garden coming up, and the particular quality of the light over the mountains in the late afternoon, gold and long and unhurried. She put her hands back in the dirt. She was going to be here tomorrow. And the day after that. Not because life had become easy. It had not, and she did not expect it to. But because she had made her decision back at the beginning in increments so small they were barely visible. A blouse in a drawer, a letter in a fire, a knot across a barn. 100 small decisions that added up to one large one. She had chosen this. All of it. The hard parts and the tender parts, and the parts she didn't know were coming yet. And it had chosen her back. That, she thought, was the whole of it. That was all belonging ever really was. Not the place, not the papers, not even the people. It was the decision to stay made so many times, in so many small ways, that it finally stopped being a decision and became simply who you were. She stayed until the light changed. Then she washed her hands at the pump and went inside to start dinner, and the door closed behind her, and the house held all of them, and the mountain stood at the edge of the world in the last of the light, and the spring evening settled in around the ranch the way it did every year, without asking, without apology, just arriving, the way all necessary things do, exactly when they were meant to.